Hey everybody, today we're going to start learning about keys and labeling chords. Now this has to do with some of the math in music and might seem a little intimidating, but I think you'll surprise yourself with how easily you understand this. Now to start with, we're going to play through a new chord progression. Now I'll tell you up front that this isn't actually attached to a song. It's a practice exercise, but it's going to be useful to us. So let's get started. There are 16 bars to this whole thing, but we'll just look at the first 8 in the beginning. We're going to play this 4 beats per measure with a quarter note pulse, so each chord is strummed 4 steady times. It's not too terribly hard, and I'll bet you can even play it perfectly the first time. So, let's give it a try. 1, 2, 3, and... Alright, good. Now, as we move on to studying keys, we need to understand what a key in music actually is. And what a key describes is a song's tonal center. You've got your tone, or note, and you've got your center, what all the other notes revolve around. It's like a musical solar system, with the sun being our main note and the planets being the notes orbiting around it. Okay, we've described a tonal center, but how do we find it? Well, we're going to try this. Let's take the last 4 bars of this exercise that we just played, but let's take away the last measure. Why? Because I want you to hear this. I'm going to replace the last chord with an F chord and end on that. Let's listen to how that sounds. Feel free to play this with me. Ready? 1, 2, 3, and... Now here's a question. Does this sound done to you? Or does it feel unfinished? What if we take out the F chord and put in the G chord instead? 2, 3, and. It still doesn't quite feel finished. It doesn't sound bad, but it feels like something else should happen. And if we end on our A minor chord, what does that sound like? 2, 3, and... Still doesn't feel finished to me. But luckily we have 1 chord left. Let's end where we began, bringing back our C major chord. 2, 3, and. You hear that? We finally have a chord that makes us feel like we're finished. Like a period at the end of a sentence. And there's a musical term for this. It's called resolution. That feeling you get when it seems like we've landed on the right chord to finish the song, that's called resolution. And now that we have the chord that makes us feel resolved, we can answer this question. What key is this progression in? Because the chord that makes us feel resolved is the tonal center of our song, and in this case, that chord is C major. So, to recap, the key of a song describes its tonal center. And if you've ever identified whether a song is major or minor, what you're really doing is figuring out what key it's in. But now back to our chord progression. We figured out that it's in the key of C major. This doesn't just mean C is our main chord, but also that the C major scale is our main scale. It's worth pointing out that we've already done this before. Back when we first started learning how to read tablature, we played through this. And what we played here was a C major scale. Now, I said back then that we were going to attach actual notes to tab at some point in the future. Well, it's the future. The notes that we were playing were C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and then C again. So basically low C to high C in alphabetical order. And that's one really helpful thing about the C major scale. It's the only major scale with no sharps or flats in it, which makes it sort of like a blank slate. Now, this may take a little time to remember, but it's important to know what notes you're playing on the fretboard. So this is a thing that's worth practicing, going up the C major scale and down again, all the while thinking about what notes you're playing. Soon we're going to learn how these notes are written in standard notation, but for now, this is enough. So let's get back to our chord progression and keep moving forward. What we're going to do next is look at how the notes and chords are related to each other. And this is what I mean by labeling chords. When you listen to music, what you're really hearing is not just notes, but how notes work with each other. And our first step is to label the notes in our scale before we get to the chords. And this is going to be pretty simple. Ready? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That's it. Nice, easy way to keep track of things, right? And it helps give us a sense of how each note in a C major scale relates to C, whether it's the second note, or the third note, or the fifth note. Now, with that in mind, we can use the same approach with labeling chords, but there's a small problem. We already used numbers to label our scale notes. If we use numbers for chords, how are we supposed to know that it's chords we're talking about and not notes? And chords can be major and minor. How are we supposed to be able to tell the difference? Luckily, there's another number system, given to us by the ancient Romans. Roman numerals were the numbering system developed by ancient Romans sometime between 850 and 750 BC, inspired by their Etruscan neighbors in the north. Despite its age, you don't really use them on a day-to-day basis anymore. Probably the only time you really see them is in movie sequels, Super Bowls, and fancy clocks that people like to show off. You don't use them often because they're kind of on the confusing side. There are 7 different letters, which each represent a different number, and in order to write anything you need to combine the letters together. For instance, 2 I's would mean 2 and 2 X's would mean 20, and then there was also a confusing system where putting a smaller number in front of a bigger number meant you subtracted the smaller number, so an I and an X would actually be 9, and to write 1996 you would have to write MCMXCVI. You can imagine what it would be like having to do your homework with this, which is why the number system you're used to, Arabic numerals, took over. But Roman numerals can still serve a purpose for us. One of the handiest features of Roman numerals that make them different from other number systems is that they look like letters. And remember that we still got the issue of telling major and minor apart. But having letters helps with this problem because with letters we have capital and lowercase. Sure, that's helpful, you say, but Roman numerals are still so confusing. Writing out the numbers takes forever. Well, here's a solution to that too. We've only got 8 notes in our scale. Therefore, we only need the first 8 Roman numerals, and that's easy enough to remember. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. We never even use any letters besides I and V. Easy. So since we've got that figured out, let's go back to our C major scale, where we've already labeled the notes, and label the chords we have so far. The first chord in our practice chord progression is C, so let's do that one. C is the number 1 note in the key of C, so this is a no-brainer. C is 1, and because it's major, it's capital. Next chord is G. Where does that come in on our scale? G is number 5 and major, so we would use a capital V, which means 5. How about A minor? The A note comes in at number 6 on our scale, and 6 is written as VI, but remember, this is our 1 minor chord, so we write it lowercase. And next is F, which is number 4 and major, and is written as IV. I know it's a little confusing at first that 4 and 6 look so similar, but so do 6 and 9 in Arabic numerals, and you handle that just fine. So this should be manageable. Are you with me so far? So we've got Roman numerals for our chords, numbers for our notes, and now I'm going to give you one final piece of important information. This is a musical rule. If you keep studying music, you'll find that you might bend or break some rules, but for now, this is something you can count on. In a major key, 1, 4, and 5 chords are always major, and 6, 3, and 2 are always minor. We've only learned 4 chords so far, so some of this doesn't apply to us yet, but it will. Remember which numbers are always major and always minor, and we can move on to these 2 odd ones out, 7 and 8. 8 is easy. When talking about notes in a scale, we can talk about the low note and the high note, in this case C. But we don't worry about that with chords. A C chord is a C chord, whether it's here or here. So just like we labeled this one with a 1, we also label this one with a 1. In the land of music, 8 equals 1. Now go tell that to everyone you know and see what they think. But what about 7? Is it major or minor? Well, that's a problem. 7 isn't either of those. It's a special chord called diminished. And since we're not dealing with diminished chords right now, and they're very rare in most pop music anyway, we're just going to skip over that one and put a funny emoji here instead. And now we have enough knowledge to start labeling chords in a major key. All that's left to do is put this into practice, which we shall now do with the practice chord progression. You can see here that it's longer now. This is the other half of the practice chord progression. And since it's in the key of C, I do have a name for this. I call it Practice in C. Isn't that creative? Anyway, before we play it, we're going to label the chords. All the C chords, number 1. And what do we label G? Number 5. How about A minor? Well, there's only 2 of them, but we labeled them as a lowercase 6. And F, that is number 4. Now, not only can we see the chords, but we can start to see behind the chords and see how they're related. Now, let's try playing this. 1, 2, 3, and. Alright everyone, I'm sure you did great at this. It's not very hard to play, but it is a little long, so practice it if you think you need to. Now, we'll return to our practice in C exercise at another point, but there's one final thing we need to learn. Remember when I talked about the pop chord progression and the blues progression, and I said that there's more going on here than just the letter names of the chords? Well, here it is. With our new ability to label chords, we can see how exactly the chords relate to each other. The pop chord progression becomes 1, 5, 6, 4, and the blues chord progression becomes 1, 1, 1, 4, 4, 1, 1, 5, 4, 1, 1. And you might ask, why isn't it enough to just memorize the chord names? Because C is not the only key we are going to play these progressions in. And to do that, we need to remember how chords work together. Think of it this way. If it's a mile between your house and McDonald's, and you want to find other places that are a mile apart, it won't help to obsess about your house or McDonald's, unless maybe you're hungry. You need to be able to measure a mile. So keep these things in mind as we go on, and in the next video it'll be time to add a new tool to our toolbox. If we remember that the number 2 chord in any major key is a minor chord, then we can figure out that in the key of C, our next chord is going to be D minor. And how do we play that? Wait till next time, and I'll show you. Thanks everyone.